Right here?
Yep.
Yep. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, so welcome. My name is Jamaica Ramsey, and I'm the current editor-in-chief of the Journal of Law and Society. Founded 26 years ago, we say that our journal is a scholarly arm of the Damon J. Keith Center of Civil Rights, which is where we are right now. So our journal addresses a range of local, national, international issues related to public interest and society at large. So I just wanted to take a couple of seconds to welcome you all. And at this time, I will quickly, because I promised I would be brief, turn it over to my symposium director, Shay Mace.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamaica. And thank you all for being here. I really appreciate you guys coming. As Jamaica said, my name is Shay Mace, and I'm serving as the symposium director and reviewing editor of the Journal of Law and Society this academic year. It has been my honor to organize this symposium on a topic that I am very passionate about. And I'm very, very grateful to our panelists for making long travels to come here. So I will introduce them one by one. So today, first, we have Professor Sara Gold, to my right here. Professor Gold directs the Medical Legal Partnership Clinic at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law. She supervises law students representing low-income clients living with HIV in a range of civil legal matters, including Social Security, disability benefits, custody, employment discrimination, medical decision-making, and legal name change for transgender clients. Professor Gold teaches students to understand and recognize how a client's environment, including poverty and other social determinants of health, impacts their physical and mental health, and the critical role that lawyers can play in advancing health outcomes for vulnerable clients. Professor Gold teaches her students about the influence of trauma on individuals and families, and how to protect trauma and how to practice trauma-informed and client-centered lawyering. Prior to joining the faculty at the University of Maryland Law School, Professor Gold practiced law in various capacities, including as pro bono manager at the law firm of Howry LLP in Washington, D.C., visiting professor in the Domestic Violence Clinic at Georgetown University Law Center, and supervising attorney litigating child abuse and neglect cases in the D.C. Office of the Attorney General. So welcome, Professor Gold. Next, we have Professor Albrink. Laken Albrink, also to my right here, is a licensed Kentucky attorney and assistant professor of legal studies at Morehead State University. She also serves as the legal studies program coordinator, divorce clinic coordinator, and is the university's student conduct hearing officer. Laken received her Juris Doctor from the University of Kentucky J. David Rosenberg College of Law and her bachelor's degree from Morehead State. Laken has experience in private practice and state government. Her research focuses on child welfare, trauma-informed care, and elevating first-generation student success. So thank you for coming and welcome, Professor Albrink. And then finally, we have Professor Deeya Haldar. Deeya is the Associate Professor of Law and the Director of the Civil Justice Clinic, or CJC. The CJC focuses on domestic violence survivors as clients and represents them in a variety of civil legal matters. Professor Haldar previously served as an adjunct professor for the Drexel Civil Legal Field Clinic at Philadelphia Legal Assistance, working with law students to represent domestic violence survivors in Philadelphia's family court. Professor Haldar also served as a supervisor of the Family Law Unit at Philadelphia Legal Assistance. Before Philadelphia Legal Assistance, Professor Haldar worked as a law guardian at the Legal Aid Society of New York and clerked for Justice Carolyn Berger of the Delaware Supreme Court. Professor Haldar also performed pro bono services as a volunteer attorney with the Support Center for the Child Advocates and Philadelphia VIP. She earned her BS in Human Development and Family Studies from Cornell University and her JD from New York University School of Law. So welcome, Professor Haldar. So without further ado, I will hand the mic over to Professor Gold. Here we go. Okay.
Great, thank you so much. Hi, everybody. We are so excited to be here. Both to be here and quite frankly, preparing for this presentation has been really fun for the three of us to work together as three people who really believe in the importance of understanding trauma and being lawyers who understand trauma. It's been really nice to kind of collaborate with like-minded people. So our goal for today, understand we are kicking off your 3-day amazing symposium. Our goal for today is really to introduce people to what trauma is, what we mean by trauma, what we mean by trauma-informed lawyering. It's not a topic I think that traditionally is taught in law schools. And so just to get a sense of the audience and where people are coming into this conversation, just by a show of hands, how many people have sort of had any kind of education or training on trauma or trauma-informed care? Is this a new topic, sort of familiar? Okay, you're all here, so you probably are interested in the topic and probably have some familiarity. Okay, so we're gonna lay the groundwork. I will say, everybody comes to this conversation with different lived experiences, right? And so we recognize that. We're also going to talk a lot about just the sheer prevalence of trauma. So if anybody in this room ever needs to take a break, to go outside, to get water, we certainly don't want anything that we talk about to be triggering for anyone. But if you do, totally good. Do whatever you need to do. Walk around, get water, do whatever. Okay, so with that, I will start. Shay already introduced us, so I'm not going to do that again, but here's who we are and here's who we are. All right, so to start with our roadmap, our goals for today, we're going to start just by talking about our learning objectives when we put this together, the things that we would love for you to be able to take away from today's presentation. Then we're going to I'm going to just talk about just sort of how we define trauma, understanding what we even mean when we use the label trauma and what is trauma. Then Laken's going to talk about how trauma can influence the legal representation of clients, how we as lawyers actually, can practice in a way and work with clients in a way that is trauma informed and what that means to be trauma informed. And Deeya's then going to end with a section on, okay, that's great. We know it's important. We know what it is, but like, how do we do it as a practical matter? Our hope is to talk for about 45-ish minutes and then leave the second half of our time for discussion and questions. So feel free to be jotting down questions or things you want us to go into more. We're happy to at the end. Okay, learning objective. So we will have been successful, I think, if you all leave with kind of an understanding of what trauma is and what trauma-informed lawyering is and what it means. If you understand the prevalence of trauma and how common it is, and really how it influences the lawyer-client relationship. Trauma is not just something for behavioral health specialists to understand, but anybody who is going to be providing good representation to clients really needs to understand how that influences our relationship as advisors and counselors, and also as advocates for our clients. And then hopefully you will be able to start germinating and reflecting on some opportunities to be trauma informed and incorporate some trauma informed practices into either your work if you're taking a clinic here in law school or in your future practice when you graduate. Okay, so that said, I am going to start the first section about understanding and defining trauma. Oops, there it goes. Oh, I didn't realize it was going to do that. Okay, so what we mean by trauma really can be any event that is beyond a person's capacity to manage, right? And so there is no absolute objective, this is trauma, this isn't trauma. Trauma very much is a little bit subjective. It depends on the person who experiences it. Trauma is sometimes defined by 3 E's, right? The first E is the event. What is that event that somebody experienced, and what may be a traumatic event to one person may not be a traumatic event to another person. And that relates to the second E, which is experience, right? And so how a person experiences an event will determine if it's traumatic, right? And so different people experience events in different ways based on a lot of factors, right? Things that we can imagine, and you know, may have experienced this. Something may have been traumatic or distressing or beyond, you know, someone's ability to cope, but somebody else may have sort of been fine with it, right? And so depends a lot on the age in which somebody experiences trauma, at what developmental stage you are. It depends on prior experiences. So if somebody has had prior experiences with trauma, you know, layering on another event might be more traumatic or beyond that person's ability to manage or cope. And the support system matters a lot, right? Somebody who has a very strong support system may be able to be more resilient and cope and manage through an event, whereas somebody who really doesn't have safe relationships and a support system might have a more difficult time. And then the third E is effect, right? What effect this experience and event has had on the person. And so traumatic events have lasting adverse effects on the person's functioning, their mental, their physical, their social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And so traumatized people, you know, chronically feel unsafe. Safety is a thing we talk a lot about when we're understanding trauma. There's issues of safety. And so this is a quote from Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, which is, you know, a book about sort of chronic trauma and toxic stress. Oh, I didn't know I did that either. Okay. So when we go to the first E, an event, what kind of event is traumatic? I think typically people think of like big, significant events as traumatic: war, being in combat, natural disasters, the Holocaust, you know, big, significant events. There's different kinds. And so I think our goal here today is in part to expand your range of thinking about the kinds of events that could constitute a trauma. So this slide, oh, you can't see the top part, but, oh, you can? Oh, I can. Or down. I don't think it goes up. Okay, so there's big T trauma, which are those big significant events, I think, that we typically think of as traumatic. These are events that leave you powerless, a lack of control over what's going on. And so those are examples of what we call big T traumas. There's also little t traumas, which are maybe less significant events, but can also leave a person feeling helpless, beyond a person's ability to cope. And then there's C trauma, which is either complex or chronic trauma, right? And so these are traumatic events that that persist, that go on for a long period of time, and also create, you know, this toxic stress kind of reaction. Oops, now I can't move to my next slide. Sorry. Okay. The other thing to know about trauma is incredibly common, right? There's been a lot of research about trauma, and these are some statistics that just indicate to us how many people in our world, in our country, in our society have experienced trauma. 6 of every 10 men, 5 of every 10 women experience at least one trauma at some point in their lifetime. Women are more likely to experience sexual assault and child sexual abuse. Men are more likely to experience accidents, physical assault, witnessing death or injury. While most people who experience trauma don't develop post-traumatic stress disorder, which is actually a DSM diagnosis, about 7 to 8% of the population will develop PTSD at some point in their life. This slide is meant to depict sort of another kind of trauma. So we talked about how when you experience trauma, at what stage in your development and age matters in terms of how you experience the event. So there's trauma that we experience as adults. There's also trauma that we experience as young children, right? And it affects people differently. When you experience trauma as a young child, which is sometimes referred to as adverse childhood experiences, have people heard of the ACEs? Okay, it really does affect the architecture and the wiring of your brain, because when you're a young child, and I am not a child development specialist, but your brain is growing and developing, right? And so when your body produces these intense excess levels of stress, it really does. There's been lots of studies by neurologists and developmental people that shows that it affects the connections, the wiring, and the development of the brain. It affects brain development as adults too, but in different ways. So when our body releases stress hormones, which are good and necessary to protect ourselves, like we've all heard about the fight or flight response, right? That keeps us safe. That's the amygdala. That's a part of your brain that does that to keep us safe. But when people are experiencing lots and lots and lots of toxic stress, it's too much for the brain to handle. And especially during early childhood, when your brain is developing, it does change the architecture. So this slide is meant to represent different realms of ACEs and sources of stress. The tree, and I'll have a couple slides that show this in different ways. The tree up above is meant to, it shows individual adverse childhood experiences that people experience in childhood that can lead to these negative outcomes in adulthood and change the wiring of your brain. Down below, the roots of the trees are meant to show community experiences that also affect the way your brain is wired and are sources of trauma. So those things are more like, poverty. They're also referred to as social determinants of health, if people have heard of those. So these are existing conditions in our community or in our environment that also lead to negative outcomes. And each of those are sources of trauma. Here's another slide depicting the same thing. The tree up above is these individual experiences of trauma. And then the roots below are the community environment factors that also exacerbate one's experience of a traumatic event. Lived experience, super, super important. These are a couple quotes of, in my clinic at Maryland, we partner with an HIV medical clinic. The patients at the HIV medical clinic had put together a book at some point sharing their stories. It was meant to be stories of resilience about how living with HIV, is not the end of life and people can be really resilient. And so going through these stories, what struck me is so many of these people shared stories of traumatic events in their childhood, right? So this is just anecdotal information that supports the research about just how prevalent trauma is. And so some of these are individual ACEs and some of these are the community environmental factors, right? You can read them, right? But so these are emotional abuse, neglect, there are conditions in the neighborhood of routinely being raided by the police, experiencing violence in your community, and also sexual abuse. And these were just 3 that I plucked out of this book, but pretty much every story had some shared experience of having experienced some kind of trauma in their childhood, just extremely common. The ACEs study, which is where this adverse childhood experiences sort of came about and shows us how prevalent it is. It's another source of research. For those of you who don't know it, I'll just describe it really quickly. This was a study published in 1998. It was done in combination with the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, where they interviewed and surveyed people who were covered under Kaiser Permanente's insurance plan and asked them questions. So these were just a sampling of the general population, not people who were supposedly more likely to have experienced trauma, and asked them, there are the 10 categories of ACEs. Have you experienced one or more of these ACEs in your childhood? So there were 17,000 members who were surveyed. And the results showed, which I'll show you, a significant portion of the general population answered yes to having experienced one or more of these original 10 ACEs. Since the original study was published in 1998, there's been lots of additional research and additional categories of ACEs have been added. And people are still saying, yes, we've experienced one or more of these ACEs. So additional future studies have been assessing and asking people things about witnessing violence, living in unsafe neighborhoods, experiencing racism, living in foster care. There was an urban ACE study after the original ACE study that added, these 5 criteria to ask people, have they experienced these things in childhood? And the results show that ACEs, as we know, are extremely common, right? 25% of respondents said they've experienced, physical abuse, substance use in their household, parental separation, or divorce. 2019, there was another study with even more respondents. So now there was 214,000 people who were asked these questions, and it showed the same pattern, right? 61% of people had at least one, and 25% reported 3 or more ACEs. Emotional abuse was the most prevalent. And so we know that people in adulthood, significant portions of them experience some form of adverse childhood experience as children. And we care about that. The original ACEs study was trying to measure the correlation between future disease that led to the highest causes of death in adulthood with early childhood trauma. So to get at prevention, right? To be able to say, okay, well, let's try to develop treatment and intervene in childhood so that we can help people with trauma so that we don't have people resulting in, dying of diseases when they're adults. But what's been interesting, I think, for at least me, is our clients who we're representing have a lot of these risk factors or coping mechanisms that we see as for people who have experienced ACEs as children. And so it makes me think, given the high prevalence of ACEs and given that we're representing vulnerable clients with a lot of these risk factors and coping mechanisms, probably a lot of them have experienced trauma in their early childhood, right? And so what does that mean? And Laken's going to talk about that. What does that mean for us in terms of building a relationship with people who likely have experienced trauma in their childhood that we may never know about, right? It's not relevant when they're coming to us to represent them, in a legal matter necessarily, like what happened to you as a child, but it does affect our relationship with those clients. So this graph shows how ACEs produce, the number of ACEs has this dose response relationship. The more ACEs you experienced as a child, the greater likelihood of adult negative outcomes. Another graph that shows the same thing, the more ACEs you experienced as a child, the greater likelihood that you are dealing with mental or physical health problems as an adult. I know this symposium is focusing a little bit on substance use, right? Yes. And so here's a graphic that shows that the more ACEs that a person experienced in childhood, the greater the risk that they are using and doing injection and drug use as adults. This is my final slide before I'm turning it over. I know I went over my time. I promised I wasn't. I apologize. This is another graphic that sort of shows that trajectory of experiencing trauma and how that leads to coping mechanisms, adaptations, health behavior risks, and ultimately higher rates of early death. The graphic on the left was the our traditional understanding of how ACEs worked. The graphic on the right really adds those additional layers that come before the individual experience. So these are the roots of the tree. Individuals who are experiencing community trauma, who are have experienced, or groups of vulnerable people who've experienced historical trauma, if you're already starting at that place, when you layer on these individual traumatic experiences as in your childhood, you're experiencing the trauma to an even more significant and greater extent. There's a whole field of research, which I'm not going to go into, epigenetics, which actually shows that trauma can be passed on from generation to generation. So there's studies that show that if a mother is living through, trauma while she's pregnant, that it actually leaves a chemical mark on the unborn child. And when the child is born, that doesn't change the genes, but it sort of makes a gene be exposed, like sort of a light switch that turns it on and off. So generational trauma can be passed on from generations as well. And so I will turn it over to Laken to discuss how trauma affects our attorney-client relationship and what we mean when we talk about trauma-informed lawyering.
Yeah, so actually I want to first go back to your ACE slide here. And so I want you to take a look at this chart again and note that the different types of trauma that leads to, or the different types of adverse childhood experiences. These are all things that if happening to a client would present someone in our law firm. And so, incarcerated relative, divorce, those are specifically linked to the court and the legal system. And so I think as attorneys, we are especially poised and positioned to be dealing with clients who have experienced trauma, not just as kids, but also as that trauma is unfolding in their lives. So at the height of that traumatic experience. So we're really positioned in a profession where we're working with clients who've experienced trauma, and we're working with them at a time in which that trauma is impacting their lives, probably the most severe. And so as attorneys, it's really important that we understand trauma and we understand what our clients might be going through, both in their past and in the present moment. And we think about that layering that Professor Gold mentioned. And so we're uniquely positioned to help our clients through those traumatic experiences. And I think we really have to do it with this twofold goal of promoting resilience for the client, and then also creating better case outcomes for them. And so we know the impact of trauma, and we know how that can impact people, even down to their health. But we also know that there are protective factors and there's resilience, and people can bounce back. And that's what resilience is your ability to bounce back from trauma. And there are lots of factors that impact a person's resilience. But as attorneys, we're positioned to be able to provide that for our clients. And I think that to be an ethical attorney, we have to help our clients in a holistic way. And it's not to say that as attorneys, we're taking off our attorney hat and we put a therapist hat on. We're not becoming therapists, but by the way we practice our cases, we can help our clients bounce back from the trauma that they've experienced. And that's what we're going to talk about. And Deeya is going to get into those specific things that we can do. It's also going to help us have better case outcomes. We want to do the best by our client and help them be resilient, but we also want to be successful, right? Probably no one in here wants to take a case and lose it. You want to win the case. And by being trauma informed, we will enhance our attorney-client relationship, and it's going to make the client more comfortable to be forthcoming, to be honest about some underlying facts that maybe we wouldn't get if we were not being trauma informed. So we're also going to have better case outcomes if we adopt the trauma informed approach. And again, just taking that trauma-informed approach, it's a way that we shift how we are practicing in acknowledgement that the people we are helping have likely experienced some form of trauma. So Sara talked about the prevalence of trauma. We should expect that the people that we're working with have experienced some form of trauma and proactively take steps to be trauma-informed. and to help the clients respond to some of those physical, those psychological, and physiological needs that they have. By taking the trauma informed approach, we're going to enhance that attorney-client relationship. We're going to build a relationship with the client where the client feels comfortable, where the client can start to develop trust with the attorney, and that in turn is going to help us be more successful for them. It's going to help the client promote resilience. It's going to promote resilience with the client and really lift the client up and elevate the client in a position where they're going to be able to bounce back more quickly from what has happened to them. It can also be really empowering for the client. So through that empowerment and through being trauma informed with the client, through giving them choices, through taking this trauma informed approach, they're going to be able to bounce back because they're going to feel more empowered. And so I want to talk a little bit about how trauma might present in our cases and what it could look like. So anybody maybe in the summer worked, you don't have to really answer this, but think back to your experience either in a clinic or working at a firm over the summer, and think about the most difficult client that you experienced or had to work with. A lot of times trauma and trauma responses can present as difficulties for the client and for the case. And that's because when a person's experienced trauma, it does change a lot of their body and a lot of how they function as a person. And it can cause different responses for different people. And so, for example, a client could have difficulty sleeping because of the trauma they've experienced and maybe because of some of the PTSD symptoms that they're having. And so that could be our client who's appearing late to court or who's missing meetings with us. It could cause, and this is one I see all the time in practice, memory disturbances. And so a client may not be able to tell you sequentially everything that happened that led to the thing that you're helping them with. If you have a client who's experiencing domestic violence, he may not be able to tell you the day it started or the order in which there were injuries or the order in which there was the control started happening. And it may start to seem inconsistent if a client tells us one thing today and then a different thing tomorrow. And so if we're not trauma informed, if we don't understand how trauma may impact our clients, we may think our client's lying to us, when in reality, the trauma has impacted their brain in such a way that they're not able to remember things sequentially like someone who maybe hasn't experienced a trauma to that level can. And so it's going to really impact their memories. Our clients could be fearful. They could be reluctant to testify. They may not identify as being a victim of a certain crime or situation. They can be hyper aroused because of the trauma. So that could be our client who appears jumpy, nervous, has excessive responses to loud noises. And when I look at that, I look at when I think about a client who's maybe on the stand and they're nervous, they're looking around, they maybe appear that they're lying when in reality, that's a response they're having because of how the trauma has impacted them. So it's important to know that, if we are working with the client and there seems to be, I would call these some case barriers, to start to think about what could be happening in their lives that's causing this. I have clients that, the case is, perhaps the most important part of their lives, but because it is triggering to sort of deal with all the feelings, and it's difficult to deal with everything that the case has sort of made you have to deal with, they'll avoid it. And so you may have clients that it's I've helped people write victim impact statements, and it's like the day it's due is when we'll get it. It doesn't mean it wasn't a priority for them or it wasn't the most important thing for them to do. but it's really, really hard to sort of force yourself to work on something that is so emotional and is impacting you in such a way. I think it's important for us to also acknowledge that taking a trauma-informed approach is helpful for us in our profession. We know that in law and in lots of different helping professions, people who've experienced trauma are sort of drawn to those professions too. So we should acknowledge that as attorneys, we have experienced trauma. We're probably working with folks who've experienced some form of trauma. And so by taking a trauma-informed approach not just with clients, but also in our law firms, also with our support staff, also with each other, we can elevate the well-being of everyone in this profession. And so we really have to start, though, adopting a culture where we understand trauma, we understand the impacts of trauma on people, and we work with each other in a way that we can minimize the impact of trauma. And one of the things I tell my students is that we want to be zealous advocates, but that doesn't mean that we have to be adversarial with each other in that process. So I think, in law, it is an adversarial process. It is, you're in a courtroom, there's people that have different interests. And so it's necessarily adversarial, but we can be zealous advocates and still be nice to each other outside of the courtroom. So I just leave you with that and that thought of being trauma-informed and nice to each other. And in a lot of ways, a lot of the techniques that we talk about and that Deeya is going to get into, it's not only trauma-informed, but it's also just good lawyering, right? It's being ethical, it's being responsive, it's taking on that, making sure you're communicating with your client regularly, but that's good just in general. And so one of the last things I want to talk about are just some trauma-informed techniques. I'm going to leave the specifics to Deeya to talk about, but there's a lot of things we can do before we even take on representation of a client that we should be doing across the board. Now, when we are working with clients specifically, our trauma-informed approach may need to be different depending on the client that we're working with. But at least at the outset, before we start representing clients, there are things that we can do that signals to everyone, all prospective clients, that we're a trauma-informed attorney. Things like, even if you think about your website, I encourage law firms to post pictures of the attorneys. So, someone who's experienced historical trauma or racial trauma, you can see who's at the law firm. You can see if there's anyone there who looks like you. Those are things that are important to clients who've experienced trauma in some form. And so with that, I've given you some examples. I've also added this chart, just some things you can do that are specific. With the trauma-informed approach, instead of asking a client why they did something or why would you do that, it's better to ask what happened, instead of sort of those blaming phrases. And so with the trauma-informed approach, we want to be careful not to impose punitive language on a client. We want to instead ask the client about what has happened to them, and it's not about them being bad as a person, it's about something bad having happened to them. And so with that, I will turn it over to Deeya. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Laken and Sarah. So great. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we bring all of this information into lawyering, particularly into the attorney-client relationship. So a lot of the work I do is litigation, and so this is largely litigation focused, but not entirely. These are principles that you can apply in general. to the attorney-client relationship with trauma-affected clients. So I co-wrote an article some years back about trauma-informed lawyering and what it is and how to teach it to law students. But so today I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is, how we defined it in that article, and all the different aspects of trauma-informed lawyering. So there are 4 parts of trauma-informed representation. The first is identifying trauma. So Laken and Sara talked a lot about how trauma may affect individuals and how it may affect clients in representation. And Sara talked a lot about the prevalence of trauma, particularly in low-income populations. So I'm not going to talk so much about that, a little bit. Adjusting the attorney-client relationship. So most of what I'm going to talk about is client interviewing and counseling, and how to adjust both of those and the entire attorney-client relationship to account for client trauma. Adapting litigation strategies, so really thinking about the client and their trauma effects and what their goals might be, and thinking about how to bring that into your litigation planning with the client. And preventing vicarious trauma. So that's a really important one, and one we're barely going to get to today. So I would encourage you to to think more about that. And we will talk about what vicarious trauma is and how to prevent it towards the end of my part of this. So trauma may present in these particular ways in clients. Lack of affect, problems modulating emotions. Sara and Laken talked about a lot of these, how this might show up in a client's behavior, distrust in people and systems. If you're an attorney working within a court system, that's going to be enormous. That's an enormous factor in your work. Quick progression from calm to terrorize. So a client may have what you think is a irrational overreaction to something you're saying, to something that happens, and it may be a trauma response. So strategies for effective trauma-informed interviewing. So these are some things to keep in mind when working with trauma-affected clients. And as Laken and Sara mentioned, a lot of this is just good lawyering, right? To really form that connection with your client, because as we know, interviewing your client, you do that for a whole host of reasons, right? To see what the client's legal issue is, but also to form a relationship with them, to create rapport so that they will tell you more, right? So partly so they feel comfortable with you, but also so that they will tell you more so you get the correct information. So how do you do that with a trauma-affected person? Developing and sustaining rapport is the most important thing in this slide, certainly. I would argue possibly in an attorney-client relationship. Making sure that they feel that you are somebody that they can trust. So that should be kind of a guiding principle when working with trauma-affected people. How do they know that they can trust you? So really take a little time to create that rapport with somebody. Ask them how they're doing. Do they have trouble getting to your office? Things like that, but then a little bit beyond that, and kind of be ready for what their answer is. Validate and normalize their feelings. Empathy is, I know I just said rapport is really important. Empathy is also really important. They're both really just essential skills, and they're kind of, therapist type skills, but lawyers can do them. Really, we can. So that's, to me, it seems like if you get nothing else out of what I say, just really think about rapport and empathy when working with trauma-affected clients. Be as transparent as possible. Think about sharing your rationale for why are you asking these particular questions? What are you trying to do? Is that what the client wants you to do? And also make sure you understand what the client wants. What is their goal? Is it to win in litigation? That might be your goal. maybe, but maybe not, right? Maybe they have some other goal, and litigation is one way to get to that, but that may not be the only way. Think about the structure of your interviews. Think about how much time all of this rapport is going to take. It might be a lot more than you're thinking. But working with a client who is not so inclined to trust you, it's going to take a little more time. And the other thing to think about is whether you want to discuss the effects of trauma with the client. It doesn't have to be a secret. You can bring up the fact that you think that a client's trauma history is causing them to react in certain ways, and then discuss that. Think about what you're going to do about that along with the client. Have them be part of this process. Similar to the last slide, do's and don'ts. Some trauma-affected clients really want you to look right at them in the eye. Some are very uncomfortable if you do that. Take the cue from the client. Think about your nonverbal cues that you're displaying. Are you hunched over your computer? Are you not really looking at them? Are you just reading from your list of questions and then not appearing to listen to the answer? Think about all of that. You can continue to be empathetic throughout the interview and ask them, are you okay? Think about if they need some water, if they need some coffee. Think about whether they want to take a break. Often it's really helpful when you're beginning to talk to trauma-affected clients to let them know what you're going to ask them about, to give them a roadmap, and to let them know if they need to take a break, please just say something, and you're willing to do that. It's not something, their discussion with you is not something they have to go forward with no matter what. Allow time for them to vent their emotions. They might cry in your office, and that's okay, right? So try to be empathetic, try to not appear uncomfortable, even though you may be uncomfortable. Have tissues on hand. And that can be a signal to people, right? That you know that somebody might cry in your office. It's not something totally unexpected. So moving into adjusting the attorney-client relationship kind of specifically, we can discuss the effects of trauma, the ways it might affect your relationship. Think about mental health treatment, whether you think it might be helpful for the client, and you can say that to them. You can say it in a sensitive way. It might be something to discuss, and mental health treatment can kind of take a variety of forms. It can either focus on the trauma that they've experienced that might be quite some time back. For my clients, domestic violence survivors, sometimes it's very recent. Or for some clients, just being in the litigation process can be very difficult, can be re-traumatizing. So you might need or might benefit from mental health treatment just about that process, particularly if the client's going to testify about something that's very difficult, testify about domestic violence, for instance. That might be something to consider. So for some clients, depending on their history, depending on what's happened in their lives, they may have previously been ordered into mental health treatment, right? Particularly for people who have ongoing mental health issues, which, as we discussed, sometimes is related to substance abuse issues. They may have been ordered into treatment. So you can discuss with them that this is not the same thing, how it's different, but also some ways in which it might be the same, right? It is a therapy process. Clients can present with a whole bunch of different characteristics. So this slide has 3 somewhat common ways that clients may present. I don't mean to say that clients can present in only these 3 ways, or people who present as withdrawn are only withdrawn and they're always withdrawn. Every individual is complex and can have a whole series of different behaviors. However, some clients do display their trauma histories, or it shows up as being very withdrawn, that they're not really interested in discussing much of anything with you. They're not very open. So what might be helpful with that particular set of characteristics is being clear about what your rationale is for strategy and for questions. Really empathize. And it might take a long time to create rapport with this person, particularly if you're representing them in a issue that their trauma was about. Like if you're representing a domestic violence survivor, it may in a protection from abuse case, which is what I do often, they may not want to talk to you about the thing that you're representing them about, and that's going to be a big problem in your representation. It just may take you a long time to get there. And so you have to be aware of that. Sometimes clients are flooding, so they want to talk a lot to you, sometimes about what you're representing them on, sometimes about something completely different. And they may be very emotional, crying a lot. So similarly to withdrawn clients, you can take some time to validate their feelings. It may also take a long time with this particular kind of client to let them talk about what they want to talk about, and then empathize with their feelings, and then try to get them to talk about the thing that you need them to talk about. Just creating that rapport, providing empathy might take a long time. You might need to maybe in your roadmap in the beginning say, okay, I see you really want to talk about whatever it is you want to talk about. So we're going to talk about that today. But the next time we have to talk about our PFA case. There are some clients who will be angry or suspicious of you, even though you are trying to be their attorney. So the way to, a possible way to approach that is to, again, remind them of your shared goals, who you are, why you want to have this discussion with them. It's often really helpful to talk about confidentiality. It more so than usual. You should obviously talk about it anyway with all clients, but remind them of who you can and can't tell about what they tell you. And that is obviously partially to encourage them to talk to you and tell you the truth so that you can best help them. And remind the client that you're their advocate. That's your role. A little more about adjusting the attorney-client relationship for all clients. You can explore how trauma experience might impact your attorney-client relationship with the client. Think about how to incorporate this into client counseling. You may be counseling clients a lot outside, both within and outside the litigation process, about different decisions that they have to make. So the trauma is a part of them. It's a part of how they might be thinking about these issues. So you can address that openly with them and see what happens when you discuss that, when you bring that up, see what they say, and incorporate that into counseling. And think about how this affects our ethical obligations. So as Sarah and Laken touched on a little bit before, we have certain ethical obligations as attorneys. First, to provide competent representation. Understanding trauma and its effects is really part of competent representation, especially if you're working with a low-income population. Understanding the prevalence of trauma is really just part of competent representation. And also thinking about our role as counselors. Understanding trauma and its effects can and should be part of effective client counseling. Adapting litigation strategy. So clients' trauma experiences may impact decisions throughout their litigation process and throughout the litigation process you're in with them. The first decision it might impact is whether to proceed to a hearing. So a lot of times you may not have a choice as to whether you need to proceed to a hearing if you have a criminal defendant, for instance. However, sometimes you may have somewhat of a choice, right? So you can think about, how will this person testify? Will they testify credibly in a way that the fact finder will think is credible, or will the trauma effects make them seem not credible? You might have to discuss this with the client and incorporate that into part of the decision making that you make with them in terms of whether to proceed to a hearing. Think about what the client's goals are and encourage them to tell you what their goals are. So I represent domestic violence survivor clients. Sometimes I represent them in protection from abuse matters. There are particular courts where I work where I know that it's very likely that the client is going to testify in great detail about the physical abuse. And it's very likely, without any other evidence, that the judge is not going to believe her. And will say, I didn't believe what you said. I'm not granting you your order. So I've unfortunately had to have that discussion with clients in advance to say this might happen. Let's think about how that's going to feel. If your goal is safety, which is probably what it is, but I have that discussion with them, is there some other way we can reach this goal? There might be. So just because we're lawyers doesn't mean that all we can think about is litigation, right? There are sometimes other ways to achieve goals. Think about strategies for hearing preparation. So for trauma impacted clients, you might really need to talk a lot about what is going to happen at the hearing. I'm going to ask you, the client, questions, but also what else is going to happen? Is the judge going to ask you questions? Is there going to be cross-examination? Probably. Who else will be there? Really just be as transparent as possible. I often with law students like to do a mock hearing where I play the judge, the student's clinic partner plays the other attorney, we do a cross-examination. It can be really helpful for clients to understand what that process might feel like, especially if they're talking about something that's very difficult for them. And then the hearing itself, think about whether you can have the client bring a support person. That's going to be helpful for them. Somebody like a relative, if there's somebody like that. And mental health treatment, like I talked about before, if you have a long time till your hearing, that might be helpful to get them ready. So those are some strategies for the hearing itself. Think about whether your judge will let you take a break, will let the client take a break if they need one, and how are you going to arrange that? So we have like a minute to talk about vicarious trauma. So the first thing to realize is vicarious trauma is something that happens to helping professionals in working with trauma survivors continuously, often. And the symptoms of vicarious trauma are really similar and pretty much the same to symptoms of trauma. So all of the things that are trauma effects in clients, people who work with them and help them, like mental health professionals and lawyers, can feel those symptoms as well. And you can see the list here. So it's definitely something that's being studied more in lawyers, but hasn't been very much. Here's the definition: harmful changes that occur in professionals' views of themselves, others, in the world, as a result of exposure to the graphic or traumatic experiences of their clients. So that constant exposure to client trauma can have effects on attorneys as well. One thing you can do to try to prevent or recover from vicarious trauma is thinking about self-care. What you need so that you can go on doing this kind of work. So that's what self-care is. There are many different areas of self-care: personal, which has often a physical and psychological component; professional, what do you need to develop as an attorney? What kind of care do you need? Organization, work setting, there are lots of self-care related things that a organization can do, like a law office, a legal services organization. More and more law offices are beginning to think about that, and societal and systemic. So we made a list of resources for us to think about, for you to think about as you go forward. Particularly vicarious trauma, we didn't really address as much as there is to say about it, but really this whole topic, there's a lot more to learn, to talk about. So we would encourage you to do that.
Before we go to questions, I just wanted to say one thing about the vicarious trauma, which could be a whole other presentation. I'm sure we could all talk a ton about, and this concept of self-care. And I always, as I'm sitting in a classroom of probably stressed out law students by this point in the semester, those self-care items and suggestions are really important, as you all are. My pitch is it's part of developing your professional identity too, right? And so I know as law students, we all see it in our own practices back at our own law schools, is we're not really very good at practicing self-care and taking care of ourselves. And so I would just put that out there to really truly think about it, not as just a label of like, oh, we have to do self-care, right? But being a lawyer is amazing. It is such a rewarding, rich experience. But if you don't take care of yourself, you can't enjoy it and be fulfilled by it and do the best work for clients. So it really is important to take time and figure out what you need to do to preserve yourself. The analogy is often used is when you're on an airplane, they say put your, oxygen mask on yourself before helping others. So I would just put that plug out there for sort of self-care too.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. So we'll open it up for questions. Anyone can just raise their hand, and then whomever wants to answer can feel free, and you don't have to come back up here. If you just want to sit in your chair and answer them, that's fine. So yes.
Sure, I was just curious, what happens when trauma actually relates directly to litigation or a case at hand? So I was a criminal client who had traumatic things that happened in her life. What do you do in that situation where the trauma has to be a little more forefront?
Yeah, I can answer. Do you want to, you deal with that in your practice all the time, right?
Well, somewhat. Yeah. I mean, so I like I mentioned, I work with domestic violence survivors, and sometimes I'm representing them on protection order cases. And so part of what they might have to do in terms of getting a protection order from the court is testifying about what caused them to file, what the current trauma is, what the current physical abuse is, and for some people, what's been happening over the course of many years that is considered physical abuse. It's really difficult. I mean, I wish I had something more helpful to say. Besides, I think it's helpful to really understand that working on that relationship is really important for clients to feel comfortable talking to you. One thing that I guess I didn't say is, I guess I had to, is to really be transparent with the client about what might happen, but also that you might think it's unfair, right? That you think that the court system is not necessarily going to do what would be the right thing to do. So sometimes that means that the client will testify about the trauma and they won't get their protection order for whatever reason. I think it can at least help the client to know that you believe them, that you're trying to work with them, and you're trying to get them the goal that they want. You're trying to get them to achieve that goal. But it's really difficult, unfortunately. And mental health treatment is the other thing that I would say, thinking about having this person go to some sort of therapist, often a group. There are groups in Philadelphia that really work with survivors of domestic violence who are engaged in some sort of court proceeding. And it seems like a lot of the discussion is about exactly this, is about how the court doesn't always really do the thing that you think it should be doing. And it at least gives people a way to kind of process that emotion. So to think about mental health treatment for the trauma as well as the litigation process.
Yes, I would add a couple. Go ahead. I was going to say there's three things that jump to mind in addition to what Deeya said, which I 100% agree with. Is there's a choice for the client, and Deeya talked about sometimes the client can't avoid having to testify, having to talk about it, right? If it's a defense case, right? If they're being charged in a criminal case, right? It's going to come up. But exploring with the clients often think the law solves all their problems, right? You guys are probably learning the law does not actually solve all of people's problems, right? There's lots and lots of things and ways to solve problems. And one of the great skills that we have as lawyers is being problem solvers, right? And so we can consider a range of possibilities that might not be the law, right? Getting a civil protection order is ultimately a piece of paper, right? It doesn't necessarily keep you safe, right? So there might be other options to explore achieving the client's goal. So that's one piece. But for clients who choose to pursue the legal route, I guess I would keep in mind that sometimes when we feel uncomfortable having a conversation with a client about the intimate, the embarrassing, the traumatic event, think about whether that discomfort is partly us, right? I mean, students will often say, they'll begin a conversation with the client, I know this might be really uncomfortable for you, or this might be really embarrassing for you. And then I would say to them, is it embarrassing and uncomfortable for you, right? Because we're not used to having those kinds of conversations with a stranger about something so deeply personal. And the more that, and so I think we need to work on ourselves becoming more comfortable in this place of discomfort, right? Because clients can pick up on our discomfort, right? In my clinic, all of our clients are low-income people living with HIV. Sometimes their HIV is relevant to the case we're working on, sometimes it isn't. And so students, we have to ask about it sometimes, and students always say, no, this is really uncomfortable for you. Well, the client wants to feel like you're good with their HIV. Like, this isn't an issue for us. It's not stigmatizing. We're fine. And so it's figuring out a way to sort of be comfortable ourselves with having the conversation. And then the other thing I would say in terms of sort of seeking other support and interventions for our clients, I'm really fortunate is I work in a medical legal partnership clinic, right? So we partner with the HIV medical clinic, which is not an available model in all places you're going to practice, but to the extent you can go out and sort of implement that model in places is amazing, because that means we're really working as part of an interprofessional team with a lawyer, medical providers, social workers to holistically address issues that are going on with our clients. Our clients are not siloed into here's your legal issue, here's your medical issue, here's your social work issue. They all go together because all those issues are connected and live together within a real person, right? And so the more that we can work together as part of a team and communicate and support each other to support the client, that's also a very trauma-informed practice too.
Yeah, and I would also add, especially the conversation about goals. So sometimes when I train prosecutors, and I train prosecutors on child sexual abuse prosecution, one of the things I hear a lot is, well, I don't want the child to have to testify because I feel like that would be re-traumatizing for them. So this word re-traumatizing, don't assume that someone testifying is going to be re-traumatizing for them. Talk to them about it and sort of, they're the experts on the facts. We may be experts on what the law is, but they're the only ones who are experts on the facts and know what they're comfortable with. Sometimes it can be empowering to be able to testify and litigate. So don't assume that you must take a plea deal or you must offer this deal, but because it's going to be what's best for the client. It may not be. It may not be what's best, and I see that mostly in criminal cases. But talk with the victim, work with the victim to see what their goals are as well in your client, because it may not, it very well could be litigating. And so another thing that can be helpful with clients, especially when as we talked about the law not being, quote unquote fair, is talk to the client about how they might get engaged in advocacy with legislation. Some clients may not want to do that, but if it's, there could be a nonprofit you can connect the client to where they can feel empowered by having, legislation changes or policy changes that they could do. And there was another thing I was going to say about your comment. I'm sure it'll come.
But this issue of empowering your client, control and safety are two huge pieces for clients who have been affected by trauma, is making sure they feel physically, emotionally safe, right, in your relationship, in your space. And then also doing what you can to put them in a position of control. Traumatic events and experiences have been very disempowering. It's a place where a client has felt a lack of control. So putting them in charge of decision making, giving them options, suggesting advocacy, all those things can be very empowering to a client who's experienced trauma.
And I had a case, this is what I was going to say. It was a domestic violence case. And this is a good example of letting the client have a say in how we litigate. It was a domestic violence case, and the preteen child witnessed the domestic violence event. And so I had mom's testimony, but besides mom's testimony, the only other thing I really had was this witness who could testify about what she saw and what she saw her dad do to her mom. And so I had a lengthy conversation with the client. You know, my goal was to win the case, right? But that wasn't necessarily her goal. She didn't want to, win at the expense of having her daughter have to testify in front of her dad about what happened. And so we made that decision together to not call her daughter to testify because that was not in line with our goals. Now, it would have been more evidence, and it seems like on paper that's the best way to go, is to call the witness that saw this thing happen, right? But that wasn't necessarily in line with the client's goals. And so we have to, again, just like shifting our practice to be responsive to what our clients need.
So my question is kind of related, but like looking around the room, I know a lot of us are sort of aspiring defense attorneys. And so it's just like, being a woman, being someone who's sensitive to, who aspires to be a trauma-informed attorney, there's just like the reality that sometimes, I'm maybe going to have to represent a client who is responsible for, this victim's trauma. And so what I wanted to get a sense of is like, what is, I think we all know what it looks like for a defense attorney to not be trauma informed in those situations. So what I'm curious of is like, what does it look like for a defense attorney to zealously represent their client while still being sensitive to the victim's trauma?
Great question.
It is a great question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Do you want to? I can say, so none of us are defense attorneys, right?
Yeah.
But you sound like you're going to be an amazing one. Just even the question is amazing, right? And so for the reference, I think there's how do I answer that? I mean, I guess one way I would answer it, I mean, you probably already are understanding, because you're going to be a defense attorney, that your client has allegedly, I mean, I think a good defense attorney never knows that their client did the act, right? And to begin with, but assuming, there's evidence that your client may have done something, I think that question of framing that around what happened to your client as opposed to what did you do is a good one in terms of being trauma informed to your client, right? A lot of behaviors, and I would be fairly safe. I never want to assume that somebody has experienced trauma, right? For me, the understanding the sheer prevalence of trauma is to broaden our range of explanations for a client's behavior. It makes us more patient, it makes us more understanding. However, based on research, my guess is a very, very, very significantly high percentage of people who are involved in the criminal justice system have experienced trauma that has, whether it be community environmental events, whether it be generational trauma and or like individual ACEs. And that has probably led them into one, neurological differences, which led to coping mechanisms, which has resulted in behaviors, right? So, but I think was your question more about how do you also be sort of empathetic towards the victim or not be
It's just like
mean in your
like this idea
defense?
of re-traumatizing. It's like, as a defense attorney, I want to zealously represent my client, but I also don't want to like make things so much worse for a potential victim of a traumatic event.
And so that's a lot to take on as one player in the criminal justice system, right? I mean, I think our system, I mean, that's probably like my next article that I'm thinking about, right? Is how we can improve our systems in general to be more trauma informed, right? And it's understanding, I think, what your role is. It is not, I think, my opinion, not your role to make the whole system trauma informed, right? I mean, you're one player in it, and yes, you want to be professional, and yes, you want to be ethical. But if you look at the rules of professional conduct, right, your responsibility is to zealously represent your client. And so when you're operating in a system that isn't quite there or close to there yet as being trauma informed, it feels icky. I use that legal label all the time, icky, right? But it feels not good to be a part of that. And so I would say the things to do are work with other stakeholders within that larger system to how do we make this more trauma informed for everybody, quite frankly, like for the criminal defendant, as well as the victim, as well as the witnesses, as well as the lawyers who are practicing in it, right? It's hard for you to be being steadfast to your role as the zealous advocate for your client, where you need to be trauma informed, understand that your client has experienced a lot of trauma, while also trying to make sure the victims and the witnesses and all these other people are okay. Like I think it gets down to like what your role is, right?
Right, I agree completely. Yeah, it seems that there might be something else that would help the victim, right? Not necessarily, not so much you're being trauma informed. I mean, I think that's something, but maybe the DA's office should have mental health support for victims of crimes, right? Or there should be something like that. It's certainly possible that that person, when they are testifying, is getting some sort of social work or mental health support. Maybe not. I mean, I don't know how common that actually is, but it certainly is possible, right? But your role is to represent your client zealously. Right. So I would agree completely that's not necessarily your role, but then also, I mean, maybe you want to think about kind of reconceptualizing the whole criminal justice system, right? I mean, I think that sounds like it's crazy, but that is, I mean, I think something that people are a little bit thinking about, partly for this reason, partly because the trauma effects on criminal defendants are huge, and especially those represented by public defenders, and then also the cross-examination aspects of victims and how that can be really difficult. So maybe we just need something different.
Right, your choice is about being effective, but
Right.
not being aware not to be traumatizing to the victim when you have another choice as a way to be zealous.
That's what I wanted to add to that too. I mean, I think I don't think those two have to be separate. You can be a zealous advocate for your client while also being trauma informed in how you ask questions. And I think that's advantageous, especially in front of a jury, because I don't think you're going to win points with a jury by attacking a victim. I think that makes you look bad and you can lose some credibility. So I think one of the things, approaching that as with trauma informed questions and being kind is going to also help your case, because you're gonna score points with the jury by not, being the mean person to the victim. So I think it's not really advantageous to come out and start attacking a victim in most situations. Anyway, you can do things like pointing out inconsistencies or things like that without sort of, asking them, having them say it over and over. You just sort of and the good thing about like cross-examination, right, is you should know the answer before you ask the question. And so just thinking about how you ask the question in a way that I mean, I don't think it hurts to do it in a trauma-informed way if it's also that zealous representation of your client. What I would say though is talk to your client too and explain that strategy, because your client may not understand why you're being nice to the victim. So explaining that strategy could also, because clients who've experienced trauma sometimes are gonna question your goals, and they're not gonna assume you're actually doing what's in their best interest, because they've been let down a lot. They've had their trust violated a lot. They've had people who have said that they're on their side and have their best interest at heart end up hurting them. And so they're gonna not trust you typically. And so just being transparent when that is your litigation strategy, of why that's your litigation strategy. It's just like a lot of the parenting books I've read, it helps to explain and really it is. Your kids are gonna follow the rules a lot better if they understand why you have that as a rule. Your client's gonna feel more at ease and trusting of you if you explain those things in advance, and this is why I'm doing this, and then they're not going to have that initial like distrust as much. So I think you should be a zealous advocate for your client, like Sarah and Deeya had said, but I think you also do sort of have a professional obligation to the profession to not re-traumatize the victim if you don't have to, or if it's not advantageous for your client. So I would take maybe a different approach and say, I do think we have obligations to victims too. Again, you can't change the entire system, but I think being cognizant of and just understanding trauma. I also like to think about it in terms of, I would rather have someone who's trauma informed asking those questions and be, I feel good about being the attorney doing that, because even if I have to ask difficult conversations, I at least feel like I would be better than maybe someone who doesn't understand the trauma informed approach. So I feel a little less bad about it. I guess.
We are out of time. Sorry this is a great question. I wish we had more time and maybe we can discuss afterwards, but I don't want to keep people have class to go to and everything. So thank you all for coming, and thank you all for presenting. We really do appreciate it. So have a great day.